Please welcome Darren Walker and Michelle Lamont.
Oh, you go.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So happy to see you here at the Ford Foundation for what I know will be a fascinating and intriguing conversation with a remarkable scholar and someone whose work I've followed and who has a big fan club she's learning at the Ford Foundation. Professor Michelle Lamont, you have written a book, and this book, Seeing Others, How Recognition Works and How It Can Heal a Divided World. Healing a divided world. That is usually the work of theologians and people of religious, and here you are taking this huge challenge on. And I want to just, because you are so modest, and I loved reading about all of the things you have accomplished in your career. I want to introduce you as the Professor of Sociology and African American Studies and the Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies at Harvard University. And among your many, many titles and attributes and awards, Carnegie, Russell Sage, the Erasmus Prize, which is a really big deal, and you served as the 108th President of the American Sociological Association. So you've sort of done it all. And here we are as we discuss in this moment, this really, really challenging moment, how we think about finding solutions to a very divided society. I'd like to start by just asking you, because you have really established a body of scholarship and work, many essays and books that you've written and co-written. How did we get, if you just were to give a synopsis of the arc of your scholarship that brought us to this book?
Well, that could be a very long answer. Well, first, I will thank you for inviting me. It's such an honor. And if you read the book, you will see that the book is really about agents of change. And the Ford Foundation has played such an important role in putting narratives at the center of strategies of change, not only the creation of narrative, but also the scaling up of narrative. And the book is all about structuring our environment differently so that people get a lot of messages about inclusion as they go through their lives. So it's not about individual grit, it's about social resilience that is created by transforming institutions in such a way that people feel supported in creating a more inclusive society. So that's how did I get there? Well, I should start by saying I love this little experiment. People think I'm French. I'm not. I'm French Canadian. And this is very important because, whoop, I'm a different person suddenly, right? And the book is about frames. It's about narratives. And I grew up at the meeting point between English and French Canada next to Ottawa at the time when the Quebec independence movement was exploding. So I really grew up in a context where the transformation of collective identity was very crucial. And I'd hate to draw a parallel with Black Power movement, what happened in the US, but it was really an experiment in reframing how the country thought about who are African Americans. Similarly, in Quebec, we were in the process of telling English Canadian and the world, the Anglo-Saxon world, actually, Quebecois are creative, resourceful, people with a lot of resources, you know. So that's a source. And then, of course, I'm the product of second wave feminism. All of us women in the room, we knew we had to fight with our brothers so that, you know, we could share household work with them. And there's so many things that have led me to think seriously about inclusion. And then I wrote a book in 2000 titled The Dignity of Working Man, for which I did a lot of interviews with Black and white workers in New York and white and North African workers in Paris. I did my graduate work in France. And it's all about, you know, their self-respect. So for me, the term dignity and respect and bringing them at these terms at the center of our agenda, I think, is extremely urgent. So in this moment.
And that was the brilliance of your book, is that it crystallized, and particularly in the American context, how the idea of work had so much to do with a person's self-worth
Exactly.
and their own assessment of their place in society. And in some ways, it is a corollary and a complement to William Julius Wilson's work.
Absolutely.
On this same subject, and just as powerfully, though, connecting to this book, because, and I'll get to that connection in a moment, but I want you to, you frame a lot of this in a way that I can appreciate, because the work here at the Ford Foundation since I've been president has been singularly focused on the issue of inequality and the harms of inequality, of all forms of inequality, economic, gender, et cetera. And you explicate that very well in the book. But I'd like you just to expand on that and talk about how inequality, as you see it as a sociologist, the impact on society more broadly.
Well, I think a lot of people are trying to address the problem with inequality are focusing on redistribution, or right now in the world of philanthropy, reimagining capitalism so it's more inclusive. At the same time, the ways in which groups are stigmatized, low-income people, for instance, being stigmatized. We know that in Sweden, low-income people are not nearly as stigmatized. It's much easier to be poor there than it is in the US. So the book's goal is partly to make the reader, the general reader, much more aware of how various forms of stigmatization, not only race and class, but many other forms as well. Rural stigma, for instance, is enormous, right? That this can be addressed. So the book also discusses how can stigma be reduced, how it's been reduced in the past. I give the example of HIV/AIDS. When I came to the US in '83, it was the middle of the AIDS crisis. Everyone was absolutely scared of people with AIDS. Not anymore. People who were obese were deeply stigmatized then. They're still deeply stigmatized. So by understanding how destigmatization happens as a social process, we, agents of change, can really act upon this. And it has happened before, it can happen more. So it's really in some ways an argument against tribalism, because tribalism, this argument is very much based on a vision of human nature which is static. While in fact, the degree of groupness that groups have varies enormously. It's a product of many other things, and we can act upon this. So as you see, the book is very much about hope, and it's written...
Yes, I love this. You have this idea of America and this idea of the hope machine.
Yeah, because of the American dream, right? Everyone who came here thinking, okay, this is what's going to allow me to live my potential, thinking, of course, that meritocracy removes barriers. It allows people to be all they can be. But at the same time, as sociologists of education have shown, it's also an inequality machine, right? My kids have two parents who have PhDs. They're born on an escalator. Now, we talk about the glass escalator as the complement to the glass ceiling, you know. So we have to be aware that we cannot put that much blind faith into the capacity of institutions to distribute resources, and we have to be much more purposeful in, you know.
Right. And I mean, your colleague Michael Sandel at Harvard has done very good work on this idea of the meritocracy myth.
Yeah.
And I think you debunk that as well.
Yeah, but a little differently in that a lot of his focus is on work,
Yes.
whereas I say we need to develop a plurality of criteria of worth, and that means really not valuing people simply because we're producers, but also because we're caregivers. The way that employers that give time to employees to take care of their children and their elderly parents have a workforce that's much more loyal and ready to go the extra mile, especially in the context of hiring Gen Zs. You don't keep them if you don't give them a work context where they feel they're treated fairly and there's room for dignity, that they're just not there as producers and competitors, if you will.
Right.
So it's really a move away from neoliberalism, I think, that we need at large.
Right. But taking on the issue of the economic system,
Yeah.
and in the context of the U.S., when we know that part of the reason identities and tribalism becomes more potent is because people feel more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And when they feel vulnerable, they look for others to blame. I mean,
Yes.
you mentioned, as you do, you mentioned the European context and the Nordic context, and obviously, the Nordics love black people until we turned up in Sweden, and I mean, they were always the part of the world that we compared ourselves to, and why can't we be like the Danes? We turn up in Copenhagen, and look at what happens. The country starts to move right. The politics, the othering starts to happen. When those economies soften, who gets blamed? Who's getting blamed are the Muslim immigrants. Who's getting blamed are the Africans who turned up as refugees. And so, how do we square the reality of economics with culture?
Well, psychologists tell us it's largely about contact, right? The more contact, the more people are able to understand each other. So in the American context for the last few decades, there's been an extremely strong increase in class segregation.
Yeah.
So if you think about the Fair Housing Act in Boston, for instance, there's a policy that every town that has, the public transportation system is required to increase how many multi-family housing units they have. Where I live in Brookline, we've done it. But we've done it not by scaring people, because then people would have said the real estate value of my house would decline. In fact, it's really by talking about climate change that it happened, because the upper middle class is concerned about climate change. So to say, we need this because we cannot have people drive hours to commute, So the two issues of low-income housing and climate change has allowed this vote to pass. So I think that's an example where, we are going to be we need to reduce class segregation little by little. Otherwise, the upper middle class has really no clue what the working class is up against, because they don't know, increasingly, upper middle class people, by which I just mean college-educated professionals and managers, people like probably everyone in this room. They have no contact, so they don't know the ways in which the working class is really struggling, So therefore, it's easier to embrace meritocracy, and we know that the embrace of meritocracy has grown exponentially everywhere. So to understand that, a lot of people try and don't succeed because they don't have the resources, right?
It's interesting that your point about the embrace of meritocracy. I think the data, yes, people who have succeeded embrace meritocracy, but more people, and as you say, I mean, there are fewer people who believe in the American dream.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. And so it's true among elites,
Yeah.
the idea of meritocracy has currency, but when you talk to regular folk, the idea of meritocracy is a myth.
It's a joke, even.
And so, I would say that part of the challenge of our politics today, and I would love your thoughts on this, is that asymmetry, that we elites sort of believe that we just need a little tweaking and everything is going to be okay, whereas people who are dealing every day with exactly what you just described are completely done with the system.
Absolutely, and even more so among the millennials and the Gen Zs, because the growing inequality for the last decade has really literally made it impossible. That millennials, when a job market in 2008, there was no hope, and they're not buying houses, right? They're really behind what my generation, the boomers, we've lived the American dream in some ways. The labor markets were opening. So part of the argument of the book is that as the hold of the American dream is declining, and you have this massive mental health crisis among young people, we really need to come up with alternative narratives. And that's exactly what's happened, because the book is based on 185 interviews with change agents.
Which, by the way, I just wanted not to cut you, but it's amazing the people you interview. I mean, you went across every sector of society, and I'm just reading through the appendix of the various interviewees.
Well, it was COVID, so people had nothing else to do. call Baratunde, can we interview you? Sure, Mike, sure. We were very lucky,
Well, you got lots of corporate leaders, so it wasn't just,
Yes,
the
yeah.
usual suspects
Yeah.
you interviewed. But one of the things that struck me when you were talking about, when I was sort of absorbing this idea of the narrative and the fluidity and the need, is something I've struggled with as a Black queer man, is the ascendancy of very, very toxic, pernicious narratives among Black men. That, for example, we saw in a recent data point that the percentage of Black men who support a presidential candidate I won't mention has doubled
Yeah.
since the 2016 election. The percent of Black men in America who support him has doubled.
That's unbelievable, yeah.
Are any of you surprised by that? I mean, it is, I was shocked when I saw that. And then I was speaking with a friend who is a columnist at a newspaper who he said, I go to the barbershop on Saturdays. And he lives down south, and he said, doesn't surprise me. Doesn't surprise me. That's the talk in the barbershop.
Yeah.
And so how do we explain that?
Well, I think it's also that how we define cultural membership in the U.S., belonging, is in part through carry your weight, pay your bills. Self-reliance is absolutely crucial, especially for the non-college educated. So, and as this man who will go on Naim is vilifying immigrants, he's really saying, oh, we want the right kind of immigrants from the right country. But 20 years, 30 years ago, immigrants were primarily framed as contributing to economic growth. And there's always this tug of war, and he's confirming a notion that they're not contributing. And if those people, African American men in the barbershop are just struggling and feeling like the world is falling apart, and they're seeing what Trump is describing to them as a traditionalist world that was so wonderful, yes, for Black men in the South especially, right? So
Right. I mean, this is but
Yeah.
but don't you think it's I believe it's also part of the way the identity and grievance
yes,
have converged.
yeah,
So that
absolutely.
So that in the case, I mean, I am now hearing about white men who feel discriminated against in corporate settings.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So
Yeah.
victims.
Yeah.
And the identity and the narrative. And so I'm.
So one way to deal with this, I was recently asked to go to talk to one of the big consulting company, international, EY, which is very
Right,
prominent.
of course,
A lot of their leadership are first gen. And the way they try to address the resistance to DEI is to say, as first gen, you've experienced being in a room where you don't really know what are the rules of the game, and to say there's parallel between your experience as a first gen and the experience of people of color and that creates solidarity. So a lot of it is about creating bridges, as was the case for the Brookline example with climate change.
Right.
So I think creating these bridges is super important, and that's, I think, what the Democratic Party needs to do more. So when it's pushing electric vehicles, when 6% of the American population can afford them, well, of course it pisses off everyone, Or the rural-urban divide in Europe with the farmers, throwing eggs in Brussels. A lot of it is about the EU, which is making policies in Brussels, constantly favoring urban areas, and their anger is palpable, I think in part for good reasons, like internet access. They're not addressing it. The list is really long of the many ways in which politicians who think of themselves as fairer than the conservative are in fact blind to a lot of the basic needs of the bottom half of the population.
So we're going to go to questions in a moment, Michelle, but I'd love for you, as you think about some of the solutions that because the great thing about this book is you diagnose the problem very, very well. And because we get this a lot of people diagnose the problem well, and you're like, thank you very much. That you too can diagnose the problem. The hard part is, okay, so how do we get out of this?
Yeah.
So I love your,
Yeah.
because you talk about that in the book.
I'll mention just 4 things.
Please.
So one is the first 2 chapters is a critique of neoliberalism, explaining how people above are winning, people below, the non-college educated, are losing. And I say we need to move away from valorizing people only based on their socioeconomic achievement and create an environment where caregivers are valued. So the example I gave earlier about employers rewarding people as carers. So that's one. Another one is the promotion of the celebration of what we all share as human beings. So there's a chapter on Gen Zs, and the Gen Zs, you know, lots of criticism addressed to them for wokeness, but for them, the pronouns, the, you know, unisex bathrooms are crucial in part because the American dream is failing them. And I argue that they're embracing inclusion as their source of hope for the future. That's the society they want for the future. So I think diffusing broadly discourse that have to do with what I call, you know, ordinary universalism, which is really what we all share as human beings, our desire to be accepted for who we are authentically, to live authentically, is really something that moves the Gen Z. So I think they're showing the way. The third approach is what I said earlier about reduction of stigma, that by studying how it happened in the past, how it can happen more. And then also I talk about policymakers, that really we need to, and to have organizations such as yours that are systematically working toward being more attuned and talking more explicitly about the symbolic politics of any policy decision, about how it's going to affect groups that feel that their needs are not being attended to, and, you know, the hierarchy of needs, and who's always taken care of, why is my group always the last group being taken care of. So that's 4 of the approaches, and the idea is really to progressively move us toward an environment where people are better able, like the whole issue is about weakening group boundaries. Right. It's about addressing the groupness of groupness, including the upper middle class. And we are, the college-educated professionals and managers are really blind to the many ways in which we're self-serving, even if we think of ourselves as really good people with the, generous people because we're progressive. But there's an element of blindness because we just spend so much time together and we don't communicate with others, and we don't understand what the working class is up against, basically.
I'd love if there are any questions. We've got microphones. Now, let me just thank you for acknowledging the Ford Foundation in your book. But I will tell you, you talk about how, we took up inequality as a narrative when I became president, and that's all been great. But, I don't think when we measure our impact, I'm not sure the Ford Foundation has had much impact. And so, I just say that to say, sometimes it's so hard to break through. And so, again, there are systemic issues that you write about, but that are so embedded that make it, some of the ideas that you are fostering, that you are putting out into the world, the headwinds are really, really...
It's true, especially now that there's such a period of counter-reaction, right? But I mention sometimes when I give talks the example of Roma, which was produced through you, and it's a wonderful example of destigmatization of a truly stigmatized and invisible group, domestic workers, and how not only did it get an Oscar, but then it was sold on Netflix. And I believe in the 1,000 points of light when it comes to narrative change. So you just put in the environment, like all the stand-up, the book has 75 interviews with Hollywood creatives and stand-up workers. The graduate students were fighting to get on this project, I can tell you that. And really fun stuff to do. But these, Camo Bell, their humor is very much about planting narratives out there, and people laugh and people relate, and they're so transparent. I interviewed Joy Soloway, who created Transparent. It's all about, when I interviewed them, they said it's about making less aberrant behavior that many people don't understand by humanizing them and seeing this woman negotiate her relationship with her adult children after she transitions. So to me, it really adds up to a lot when you look at all of it together, and it's just also the issue of polarization. I only study people who are the liberal and progressive end of the political spectrum, but.
Well, we got 5 questions, and we're going to start here, ma'am, please. And brief question.
Thank you. Miriam Safi, I work at the State Department. I used to work in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, so really thank you for this talk. We talked a little bit, you talked in the discussion about the politicization of DEIA. The acronym has sort of been renamed, didn't earn it, and then even within our institution, a lot of the measures to address this have been really performative, like, a book club or sort of whatnot. And I'd be curious, you talked about HIV/AIDS as an example. If you could dig a bit deeper into how that process of destigmatization happened and what are the elements that made it successful? Thank
Great
you.
question.
Well, in the book, we talk about the process for HIV/AIDS. What happened there that didn't happen with obesity is you have, of course, social movements, leaders, and militant, but you also have knowledge workers, legal expert, medical expert, journalists, social scientists, all feeding into knowledge that gets diffused about removing the moral blame. So HIV/AIDS, instead of being, the disease of promiscuous gay man, it becomes something that anyone else can get. Whereas people who are obese remain perceived as lazy, not able to get out their couch. So it's about the moral framing, basically, and the diffusion of alternative frames. So, and I think that has, I think that applies to, stigmatization is about moral blame, right? Moral blame, yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. Michael, please.
I'm Michael Myers, President of New York Civil Rights Coalition. My question is, in America at least, do we have racially segregated neighborhoods, racially segregated housing, racially segregated suburbs and cities, racially segregated job market? Even on the college campuses, the dorms and the job placements are segregated by race. So my question is, at least with respect to America, where in the hell do you see hope?
Thank you, Michael.
Well, a colleague has written a paper showing that if in college students share a room with someone from a different background, they move toward much more structural understanding of inequality, because that's daily contact and you come to understand the complexity of the life of people who have very different backgrounds. So I think also the current crisis of deep mental health crisis among Gen Zs, I hope, can help us get upper middle class parents to be less obsessed with opportunity hoarding, because they're telling their kids, you're going to be loved if you stay with the program and if you get into a top college. And the kids are just totally not with the program and they want to lead their life very differently. So I hope that to really reinforce this as a message, can get parents to be less obsessed with just, throwing advantages to their kids all the time, and instead trying to expose them to more diverse range of people, which would also lead us to move toward a less class and racially segregated society. So my hope is that parents care enough about their kids that they will come to understand that the program that they have for their kids is simply not working now. The statistics are staggering, So they just have to stop telling their kids, you're only going to be loved if you become upper middle class successful, because that's simply not working.
Great message. Yes, please, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much for convening, especially after the eclipse. We're trying to eclipse the current state of America through your book and this conversation. So, barbershops. Hello.
Yeah.
So I've known this for years. I've been
Yes.
talking about this for years. I was actually going to do a podcast with my barber called Black Anon, the intersection of Black identity and conspiracy theories, right?
Okay.
Because again, like I hear this every 10 days. It's fascinating. It's humorous. So my question is actually around technology, right? So I work at the intersection of social media, ad tech, and artificial intelligence. I'm actually going to be talking about this at Columbia University later this month in April, around the notion of how tech impacts how we show up as human beings and our capacity for humanity, how it is mitigated, right? And it's balkanized and it's weaponized and it's monetized. And so with this paradigm that you're sharing in terms of seeing others, how does what would you say to because I have access to all of them, what would you say to the AI, the social media, not necessarily the ad tech, but to artificial intelligence and social media companies, what would you say that they can do policy-wise so that people are more connected in a humane way than at each other's throats?
Thank you.
Oh, that's such a tough one because, of course, AI is viewed as an interrupter of recognition because it removes, recognition, I think, is something we can just give each other as human beings. It means being seen to the eye of another person. AI, I mean, even if it represents many people, it's not chosen. It doesn't have the same value as interpersonal connection. On the other hand, one person I interviewed is Jack Conte, who created Patreon. And Patreon has been enormously powerful in making available the music for a great many creators that didn't have access to diffusion and means before. So I think we have to be very nuanced in which social media we're talking about. I'm pretty anti-nudge. The nudge industry, I think, has done really bad things. And a lot of people who study narratives think that using nudges will get people to be, much more likely to want to, become more aware of the fact that they're racist, for instance. I don't think that leads us very well. It's what many organizations have done with their, implicit association tests. So I think to the extent that it is linked to the use of technology to create social change, I don't think it's a very positive path. So I think we have to be kind of, these are big buckets, AI, social media, high tech. So we really have to look at this on a case-by-case basis, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yes, please.
Hello. Hi. I was really touched and interested. You touched on building bridges and how that's the key, I think you said. And I've seen that firsthand. I absolutely agree. And I was just wondering if you can share some unexpected or underappreciated bridges that are being built around the country. I don't know if they're in your book or if you can name some, because I really think that is the way to go.
Thank you.
The only thing that comes to mind is the example I gave about my neighborhood. This people really standing for low-income housing, in part because they are committed to climate change. So I think this coupling of social problems that matter to people can be really, really powerful. Yeah. I'm sorry I don't have another example. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please. Final question.
Thank you so much. My name is Brighton. I am Zambian, which is 7,000 miles away from here. So I came to study at Columbia University some years back as a first generation, black student in class. I remember going to see a faculty advisor, and I was very excited, and they were like, "What do you want to do when you graduate?" And I said, "I want to work in America. I want to go to McKinsey or any management consulting." And they looked me in the eyes in a very somber way and said, "I think you should go back home." Full stop. I didn't understand what that meant. So fast forward, I was very lucky to be a global youth director at the UN, working with global youth, and this professor was in the audience when I was speaking. It made me realize that while talent can be evenly distributed, opportunity is not. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But how do we, from seeing others in your context, think about not preaching to the converted? How do we go to corporations? I see business school leaders that think corporations equals shareholder value. How do we speak to them? What gospel do we preach to them?
Thank you. Great question.
Do you have the answer?
Listen, I don't have, because I don't think there is an answer. I think this is layered, and in the American context, it's particularly challenging because we have a unique history of which we're both very proud. We, as a democracy, are the only country like us. I mean, we're sui generis in the world. There is not, yes, there's been colonialism and racism in the British and the European, but there has never been the American context anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. And so it is difficult to extrapolate and generalize because our context is so unique, and particularly the issues around race are so difficult to disentangle, even in examples like around, again, something that as a Black queer man, I mean, HIV and AIDS. Mm-hmm. It's true, HIV and AIDS was destigmatized, but it was destigmatized in large part because upper middle class white men in San Francisco and New York and their families
Yeah.
were being affected. Because today, there's a whole population of black folks and increasing numbers of black women who have been infected and who are affected by a healthcare system that does not respond to them, particularly in the rural South. And so even when we talk about something like that, and really double and triple click on it, we will see that at the end of the day, race has not made it possible for some to not live under that stigma that urban white gay men in New York and San Francisco
Feel
don't-
scot-free.
I mean, don't even worry about it anymore. Just take a pill or get a shot once a quarter and go on with your life.
Yeah.
So it's very hard in the American context to, without understanding the potency of race, to be the wedge that makes it hard for some of your ideas, which are very powerful, to be sustained. Yes, but to sustain them, because in our system, because we have this unique history of the way in which race has been used as a wedge to prevent the kind of bridge building,
Yeah.
it makes it difficult
Yeah.
to sustain, because at some point the economy will go south.
Exactly.
At some point, there will be a spike in crime. I mean, something will happen that represents historical patterns of repetition
Yeah.
that reteach us
Trait. Yeah.
the lessons we've already learned.
Yeah.
And so I think it's why it's important, as difficult as it is for some people, obviously it's very difficult for some people, to really say, this is our history.
Yeah.
The beauty and the majesty
Of course.
and the parts of it that are shameful.
Absolutely.
You know, and how we talk about that in society, and how ideas, powerful ideas like yours in this book, have to be acknowledged, I guess is what I'm saying.
I totally understand the resistance, in part because the history of racism is probably as central to, is as central to American history as the idea of upward mobility and meritocracy are. Like, they coexist.
Exactly.
But one of the challenge of the book is like, is recognition zero sum? Can working class MAGA men get recognition when they feel erased and ignored at the
Yes.
same time as
Yes.
African Americans?
Yes.
And when I talk about the books, I've had African Americans say, I'm sorry, these people, you just have to ignore them because
Yes,
they're just
of course.
impossible, they're ignorant, we cannot bridge with them.
Right.
And I'm thinking, how about, like, let's say you have a family, you have a kid, his birthday in September. When it's his birthday, the daughter, whose birthday is November, wants her present now. So there's this huge literature on trust, right?
Yes.
And how do you create a compact where people feel like, I trust enough in the system that I give you now
Right.
because I trust my birthday will come in November.
Right.
Can we imagine a engineering of American society, or a reorganizing where those groups that are at
Yes.
odds with each other can have enough trust in the system so that they can wait until it's their turn? I think right now we clearly are not there. But what is it that we can do to
Yes.
try to create these bonds? And if you think of the parallel of the family, a family learns you have no choice. You have to live together. Like, your family breaks up, everyone is weaker.
Well, and this
So-
was Abraham Lincoln's great speech in
Yeah.
1860 at Cooper Union.
Exactly.
A house divided.
Exactly.
So there's no doubt that what you say is true and very powerful. It is just that, and I think we should close with where the wonderful question about hope and your. I love the way you talked about this aspirational idea of the hope machine, which I'm going to appropriate from you.
We have no choice.
It's so good. I'm really mad that I didn't come up with that. It's really good, and how we keep that
Yeah.
machine.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think it's both the sense of hope and purpose, because I think there is a crisis of hope and there's a crisis of purposelessness, where people truly are questioning that.
Yeah.
And as you rightly, because you do such good work about the Gen Zs, and they particularly
Yeah.
suffer from
And
this.
the death by despair,
Yes.
like this whole literature about collective self-destruction.
Yes,
It's, I think we have no choice.
that's right. We have no choice. Thank you, Professor Michelle Lamont, for seeing others. As is the case, you all get a free book. Professor Lamont has, I think you signed some
I
books.
signed all
you
of
did?
them.
You did sign all of them?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, you go. I mean, I thought you were when I went back in the green room. I thought you were just starting to sign them. You went back there an hour.
I'm
Oh my
done, I'm
gosh.
done.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Professor
you.
Lamont, and
Thank
thank
you
you
so
all for
much.
being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you
Let me
so
make
much
sure-
for
thank
all
you.
the
This was
great questions. It was great.